Hello and welcome to With Faith in Mind. I'm Dan Hummel, today's host and the Director of University Engagement at Upper House. This episode is part of our series on Christian education at the crossroads, and we're welcoming Dr. Daniel Wasserman-Soler to the show. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Dan.
Well, excited to get to the conversation. Today we're exploring the pursuit of Christian education and formation at what I might be so bold as to call a sister effort from our Catholic brothers and sisters at the University of Chicago, at a place called the Lumen Christi Institute. So a little more about Danny before we get into a conversation. Daniel Wasserman-Soler is the executive director of Lumen Christi, a position he's held since last year. He earned a PhD in history from the University of Virginia, specifically in the history of the Spanish Empire, and that's a topic on which he's published a book and numerous articles. And Danny was a history professor for 10 years before joining Lumen Christi, first at Oberlin College and then at Alma College, where he was a tenured associate professor, department chair, and director of the first-year seminar program. So Danny, excited to talk to you today about your work at Lumen Christi. Just had a couple sort of personal questions first. One is, I think people often wonder why someone would transition from a faculty job to working at a place like Lumen Christi. If you could just give us a sense of what drew you to joining Lumen Christi just last year.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Well, first, just want to say thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be with you here. I get this question a lot, as you might imagine, and the answer is that the short answer is that it felt like a calling. I was very happy teaching full-time. I taught medieval Renaissance history, some world history as well. And I loved it. I found it very rewarding. And I did feel over the 10 years that I was teaching full-time, a growing desire to serve the church in a more explicit way. I believe, as you all do at Upper House, that one can serve God through any vocation, through any area of life. But I felt that I wanted to be part of a Catholic organization. And so when the opportunity at Lumen Christi became available, it seemed ideal to me in a number of ways. One, it is a Catholic organization and a Catholic academic organization serving a secular university campus. So I would be able to serve the church and also continue to be part of secular higher education, which I had found rewarding. And University of Chicago is also my alma mater. And I had a transformative experience there as an undergraduate. And my wife is from Chicago. So there were lots of things that came together. And giving up tenure was hard, but it felt like it was the right move for me and for my family.
That's great. Well, thanks for sharing. We have a colleague that just joined Upper House this year who did a similar move from an academic post. He had a little more circuitous route, but ended up here at Upper House. And I think echoes a lot of the same sentiments that you just did, Danny. The other personal thing I just wanted to touch on is I can't pass, just acknowledging that there are two historians on the call here. I got my PhD here at UW in American religious history. And I know everyone who gets a PhD in history has sort of their own story of why they would do such a thing. It's a very it's a very long process, one that takes up usually a lot of your 20s and possibly some of your 30s as well. Is there any particular reason you have a passion for history, or is that something that you've had? For me, it's something that goes pretty deep back. I don't know what else I would have done, honestly. I was interested in history from a young age, but what drew you to history as a field to spend a lot of time thinking in and learning in?
So when I was in college, I was very undecided when I began, and was thinking about all sorts of things. Public policy, secondary school education, among others, government work. And I landed in history, I think for a similar reason why a lot of folks do. I just had some amazing professors and found myself hooked. The anecdote that I remember most clearly as to how this happened, I was sitting in a Western Civ course at UChicago, and it was the sort of class that starts with ancient Greece, goes to 20th century Europe. And we had read a little bit of Plato's Apology at the beginning of the academic year. And somewhere around the middle, we read Machiavelli's Prince. And I can't remember the exact words, but Machiavelli says something at the beginning of The Prince along the lines of, well, you know, there have been a lot of people that have thought about the ideal government, but we're not concerned with ideals here. We're concerned with reality. And I thought, wow, he's just putting the smack down on Plato. And I thought, that's really fascinating. You know, Machiavelli's writing around 1500. Plato was writing around, almost 2000 years earlier. And that idea of that people who lived centuries apart could be part of an ongoing conversation was really meaningful to me, and still is. That I think of history not so much as the bad stuff in the past that you can avoid. I mean, it is that, but also that studying history makes us part of a conversation that we can learn from.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. I often talk in similar terms about the long conversation, and we always think we're coming up with new thoughts here in the 20th and 21st century, and nothing's really that new. To echo a biblical writer as well, I guess, on that. Okay, well, great. Well, let's jump into talking about Lumen Christi, which serves the University of Chicago campus. For the uninitiated, how do you describe Lumen Christi and the programming and offerings that you have there?
Sure, Dan. Our mission is to engage the secular university and more broadly the secular culture through in a dialogue with the Catholic intellectual tradition. Someone pointed out to me recently that it's ironic that this is our mission because universities, as you know, came very much out of, in Europe, a Catholic culture. So we find ourselves at this interesting point in history in which we're trying to reinsert the Catholic intellectual tradition into the secular university. That's one way of describing it. I think more broadly, a way that I describe it that I imagine might resonate with the folks at Upper House is that we want folks to know that Christianity is a thinking religion, that at its best, Christianity is a religion that fosters inquiry and encourages questioning.
Mm-hmm. When you think about Lumen Christi, is it something that obviously has a very local ministry focused on a particular community? Is it part of a broader network or movement of the same things? For Upper House, we're part of the Consortium of Christian Study Centers, which is a loose organization that spans 30 or 40 study centers at universities. How does Lumen Christi see itself in a broader network?
Right. There's been an informal network for some time that's just been formalized recently within the last year. So my colleagues started before I jumped on board at Lumen Christi. My colleagues started what we're calling the In Lumine network, so in the light, and it's an organization, a consortium of currently 6 institutes of Catholic thought, all of which are located at secular universities. So Lumen Christi was the earliest one, established in 1997. And then there was the St. Anselm Institute at University of Virginia. And there are also newer institutes of Catholic thought at University of Pennsylvania, at Cornell, at Harvard, and at University of Southern California. And we have some even newer institutes that are joining us soon. So one at University of Michigan probably may be joining us, and another at Duke. And there are a couple of institutes that have been around a little longer at small colleges, at Williams College and at Hope College, that may be joining us soon. All of them were started by people who either were students at UChicago and participated in Lumen Christi's programs and said, I want to do something like this when I teach, or people who were invited earlier to speak at Lumen Christi or interacted in some way with the programs and decided this is something that I'd like to do elsewhere.
Very interesting. So a lot of grassroots work sort of emerging right now. At Lumen Christi, do you see yourselves, how do you think of who exactly you're serving? Are you serving sort of the entire University of Chicago community, which would maybe even include community members, people who aren't maybe necessarily affiliated with the university? Are you focused in on students? Sort of what's your particular understanding of who you're trying to serve?
It's a great question, and it's something that's a little bit up for debate. So
Same here, by the way.
so,
Yeah.
I would say that our primary mission is serving the university community, so students, staff, faculty. But we have many of our programs are open to the broader community in Hyde Park. So that could be, there are plenty of people that have not had a formal affiliation with the university, but are welcome to come to our programs. And we have some programs that are specifically student run, but then many that are open. Over the last 25 years, the Institute has also developed a range of programs for Catholics in Chicagoland. So there's that part of our programming. So we have what we call our university program. We have what we call our cultural forum, which is Chicagoland beyond the university. And then we have a set of national programs. So every summer we have week-long residential seminars, in which there's 10 this year. And they're held in different locations across the US. And there's one in Rome and one in Oxford. And we fly students to the location. They have reading on a particular topic within the Catholic intellectual tradition. And then they have discussion for several hours a day, and also opportunities to build friendships during those programs. And with the pandemic, like lots of folks in higher ed, our programming went online. So there's started to be a bit more of a national audience for some of our programs. But so the question, as you can see, is a live one of, is it just U of C, or is it something broader?
Yeah. Oh, that's so similar to how we are sort of addressing or trying to think through things at Upper House, particularly as you mentioned with the pandemic and moving online, and suddenly having an audience, a community that's at least across the country, if not wider, and then wondering, if we just sort of return to what we did before COVID, we'd lose all those people because we did everything in person and not online. And hard decisions that have to be made, and returning to the mission and understanding exactly what fits in and what doesn't. That's, I guess, some of the work at these centers. You've mentioned a few times the community there in Hyde Park. University of Chicago is an elite university with a distinguished history, and I'm wondering what the religious ecosystem around University of Chicago is like. And I can sort of respond with some of my thoughts here in Madison, but how would you describe sort of the broader religious ecosystem that you're a part of?
Sure. And I'd love to hear more about how it is in Madison. I'm curious. So having just been there once when I was in college briefly, I'll answer by saying a little bit about my own experience at UChicago as an undergrad, aware that my experience is slightly dated now since it was 20 years ago. But my sense from the students that I've met, the current students that I've met, is that it's still similar. So I started at UChicago as an 18-year-old, and I was a practicing Catholic, had no intention of leaving the church. And but I was completely clueless that there was an intellectual tradition in Christianity. This was just complete news to me. I said my prayers and I went to church and I went on retreats, but I didn't know that there was a philosophical tradition, an economic tradition, a political tradition, all these tradition of thinking in all of these fields, in the sciences and the arts. And so I came to UChicago, and Lumen Christi at the time was a smaller organization. It was housed within the Catholic chaplaincy on campus. We still have a close relationship with them. And at the Catholic chaplaincy and through Lumen Christi, I started meeting Catholic nerds, for lack of a better word. So folks who cited Thomas Aquinas and papal encyclicals and C.S. Lewis, and of course I know Lewis is not, we love to claim him, but everyone wants to claim him. But citing intellectual giants in regular conversation as though it were the most normal thing in the world. And I thought, okay, well, I've never met Catholics or Christians, like this. This is interesting. And at the same time as I was having that experience at Calvert House, that's the name of the Catholic chaplaincy, and through Lumen Christi, I was taking core courses at UChicago. UChicago has I would say, a distinctive curriculum compared to most of its peers. It's not a list of courses that everyone needs to take, but it's different from a set of distributive requirements and say, take a history class, take a poli-sci class, take a bio class. There's a set of specific courses that are designed for a core curriculum. And many of them historically have emphasized Western civilization. It's broader now, but I think it's still the case that there's a lot of Western Civ in the core at UChicago. And so for me, I was learning about the Catholic intellectual tradition, not just in my Catholic life, but also in the classroom through taking Western Civ courses. And that was illuminating to me. And I think that my sense is that a lot of our students have similar experiences, that although it's a secular university, and there is some of the hostility you might hear about in the media, but I think there's also a surprising amount of openness to religion at UChicago.
Yeah, I was actually just there last year for a conference, an academic conference, and I was struck by even the architecture. There's a lot of, there's a major chapel. I forget the exact name of it. Maybe it's the Rockefeller Chapel. Or
you got it, Rockefeller.
Yeah, I mean, just a massive, Gothic type chapel, and then I noticed that there were a number of houses along one of the edges of campus. Many of them seem to have religious names to them. The Chabad house was there, and other things too. So that's a lot of but without the major chapel, UW has actually a very similar. We're right on the edge of campus. It has a similar layout in the sense that a lot of the religious organizations just sort of ring the campus. So right on the edge of whatever campus property there is, there's churches. We have some historic churches. We actually have a very large Catholic student church called St. Paul's that's just across the street from us. I can see their steeple just over there. That's very vibrant and is right on sort of the main walkway. I think probably one of the big differences is that UW is a public university, and so there's very little attention to religion in any official way by the university. There's no chaplain, nothing like that. But there is a deep history of this sort of proximity geographically. And then, of course, just like places like University of Chicago, many students come with religious backgrounds and are looking for either a community to connect to or are enlivened to their faith while they're here on campus. And so they need, different churches and other things. So I think it's pretty similar, but it is interesting. It's certainly a pluralistic environment where there is no default religion on campus. That's different. I mean, historically, it was very Protestant culture, if not officially, very much influenced by that. I actually was just talking to a faculty member last week and learned that up until the early 2000s, faculty here at UW got Good Friday a half day. Which is just a little nod to a sort of religious calendar. They turned that into a floating half day in the early 2000s. So now you can take it whenever you want. But there's that sort of legacy of a sort of Protestant culture. But I think in terms of who's trying to serve the community and particularly the university community, it probably looks pretty similar to University of Chicago in that way.
Yeah, it sounds very similar.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Danny, for sharing about your situation. At Upper House here, we focus on one of the main things we talk about is equipping students in particular to see the things they're learning at UW and the vocations they've chosen. So if they're choosing to be an engineer or a biologist or a historian, well, if they're choosing to be a historian, I really want them to think seriously about that before actually jumping all the way into that. But whatever it is, we see all of that as sort of working. That's kingdom work. That's work that God has called them to. And I'm wondering if you think about it, you probably maybe use different terminology than kingdom work or something like that. But how do you think about that? And sort of how do you try to get students at University of Chicago to think about their work at the university as part of their calling as Christians?
It's something. I'll give a quick example as to how we're doing that. So one of the new initiatives that we have this year, it's less than a year old, is we have just started a residence for graduate students at the university, and it's this one. The residence we started is for male graduate students, hoping to start one for women in the near future. In that community, we have a chaplain, and he runs once a quarter what he calls an integration seminar, in which he invites a Catholic professional to the house, and over a meal they have a discussion with Catholic graduate students about the integration of faith and work. So it's something that's also very important to us. I think that I would say that in addition to valuing what you mentioned, Dan, about seeing a range of secular vocations as a way to serve God, that probably what Lumen Christi has emphasized more over the last 25 years that it's been around has been that maybe just the other direction of that equation, so that how one's faith can inform how the intellectual tradition of the church can inform the various parts of our lives in the world. So how can the church's tradition in thinking about the market economy, or the church's tradition in thinking about immigration, or the church's tradition in thinking about the body, how can these inform the way that we think about our lives? So similar, but maybe I would say emphasizing the other direction a little bit more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you've mentioned a few times the Catholic intellectual tradition as sort of the body of work that you're drawing on. For those of us who aren't familiar with that, can you? I know that's a very massive tradition, but so maybe some of the names and just some of the ways you think about that tradition.
Sure. We, to your point, Dan, yes, the breadth becomes overwhelming at a certain point. So,
right.
Some of the names that would be that we encounter regularly with you all, of course, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas are two of the big ones. John Henry Newman,
right.
As well. We have seminars. Our summer seminars regularly touch on the writings of these distinguished thinkers, but it's also much broader. So it's really any way in which Catholicism intersects with one of the academic disciplines offered at the university. And so we also have had a number of programs over the years, summer seminars, academic conferences, lectures that have intersected with what's called Catholic social teaching. And I have to admit that being a historian of the early modern period, my knowledge kind of ends around 1700. So Catholic social teaching is something more recent, starting in the mid to late 19th century, a set of papal encyclicals, so papal pronouncements on specific issues in the world. And so taking those papal encyclicals and applying them to thinking about things like the market economy. How does Catholic teaching apply when one thinks of practical things like the economy, like immigration, and so on?
And these are, as I understand it, Catholic social teaching, as you mentioned, is sort of 19th century, 20th century. So really, really addressing the types of issues that we are still confronting today in a way that, there's a lot of value in reading, medieval papal encyclicals and others. But that's a largely different society, different structure, different economy, and other things. So a lot of the Catholic social teachings, as I understand it, really inform a lot of the ways that Catholics sort of live out their commitments in the world today. And maybe just to get your thoughts on this too, as I understand it, Catholic social teaching also doesn't fit neatly within a left-right political spectrum that we have in American politics, that it sort of lands in its own coordinate system that people can sort of pull things from if they're looking for it, but sort of has its own orientation that's largely around church tradition as opposed to our sort of polarization or poles. I don't even want to get into polarization, but the poles of our politics today. Is that how you describe it?
You put it really well, Dan. It makes going to election day kind of maddening. So, so we believe, along with our with many of our Christian brothers and sisters, that we have a duty to serve the poor and the marginalized. And how does one interpret that? So if you think about poor and marginalized and perhaps its most obvious meaning, maybe then you tend toward voting for the Democratic Party. But if you think about marginalized in a broader sense, and say thinking about an unborn child, then well, it makes things more complicated. So you put it really well, that it doesn't clearly flow into one political party or another. In one sense, it's frustrating, but in another, it's also, I think, refreshing in that it's a reminder that the church is in the world, but not of the world, and so it can't be represented by worldly parties.
And it's also in the world in another sense, which is it's a global tradition. It's a tradition that isn't only rooted in American concerns, and so some of the frustration is more on maybe the American side than the Catholic side, in the sense that we have a particular arrangement of politics here that leads to these binary choices in a way that other parts of the world, that's not exactly the same political makeup. Well, just want to highlight that this is one of the ways, this series is on Christian education, and the ways that places like Lumen Christi, sort of advance, and they're certainly not the only ones, but this particular Catholic social teaching is one of the ways a lot of Christians actually get education or educated around how Christian faith intersects with the rest of their life. So it may not be in this sort of formal curriculum like at the University of Chicago, but there are these other broader ways that Christian education is happening. We have that here at Upper House too, where we're trying to channel certain traditions, Christian traditions as well, in ways that hopefully educate not just students and faculty, though we hope that happens, but also the broader community. One thing I wanted to just continuing on this focus on sort of how do you enact your mission with students in particular. Are there any particular issues that come up for students at University of Chicago that you're serving around this integration question? So I think one, and this partly comes out for us because we largely serve Protestants and evangelicals even, though I don't know how many students would actually call themselves that, but students who come out of Christian traditions that really have stark divisions between secular and sacred work, for example. So and sacred work might be being a pastor or a missionary or something that's very obviously connected to a religious organization. And seeing that in many ways is the meaningful work. If you want to be sort of a pious, devout Christian, you would go into one of those fields. And for the rest of us, it's about sort of it's about basically supporting those people through financial resources or something like that. And we're trying to get students to think, well, there is a role for that, but actually God's called people to be engineers or biologists as well. And we want Christians to be in those spheres and to sort of be participating in the conversations that are happening in government, in industry, and elsewhere. So that's one of the big challenges that we face with students, is trying to get them to see a more holistic understanding of what God has called people to do in the world. Are there topics like that you sort of perennial topics that you confront with students at Lumen Christi?
Yeah, that's a great question. One that has come up frequently in my time at Lumen Christi thus far, and that was an issue for the Christian students that I knew in my previous job, was feeling as though, well, if everyone else knew what I think, I'd be ostracized. So a sort of a feeling that as a devout Christian, that speaking about one's beliefs openly on campus is not welcome, or might lead to social problems. So that's one issue that I think I've seen both with students and faculty, that I've experienced myself, at least a perceived fear. I started to get over that a little bit as I taught more, and I think I started to realize that it wasn't just a question of, well, others are hostile to Christianity. I think it was also, while there very well may be some of that, I think part of it is also, my perception, that I'm afraid to speak openly about this. So I think that's a big challenge, is thinking about, well, how is it that we can, as Christians, be open about what we believe in ways that demonstrate that we also are rational, and we don't just operate on blind faith, but that we really have thought about our positions, and that we're also respectful of others' positions, and that one can speak about what one believes without having to engage in kind of proselytism, in which one is trying to convert. So
right.
That doesn't need to be the case. I can share, and we can be open about what we think.
More of a dialogue, in the true sense of the term, of two engagements, two sides engaging. That rings. That's very familiar as well. I think a lot of students at a place like UW come in knowing, getting pretty clear signals early on in their time at UW that it's sort of publicly voicing faith, particularly Christian faith, but even for non-Christian religious people, that's not the default mode of reasoning or of arguing. And so understanding sort of how to, I wonder sometimes, I know often it is portrayed as sort of faculty are hostile to religious students, and I'm sure that's the case. In fact, I've felt that in my own life. But it's often the peer pressure, the sense that you're outing yourself as religious among your peers, among your friends, people who are going to judge you, people that you have to be around a lot more than faculty, actually, for your time at college. And so I wonder, as the religious demographics have changed, and sort of the culture around religion on university campuses has changed, that's gotten tougher for a lot of students. And they sometimes they just need community and sort of the bolstering of being around some Christians sometimes that helps that. But I also wonder, as that's something you're doing at Lumen Christi, are there particular things you tell students to, any tactics or strategies that really seem to help them?
Well, if I may, Dan, one comment you just made, if I could follow up on that, I think it gets to a question, and maybe in a circuitous way. I'll try to not be too circuitous. You mentioned that there's experiencing faculty, hostility from professors, but perhaps that the hostility is even more so with students. And I would say that with faculty or with peers, that one of the things that seems to me is perhaps the greatest challenge, even more than the hostility, which from my experience is sort of time to time, the thing to me that seems constant is that there's generally an absence of religion in public on college campuses. So I'll just give a couple of examples. When I had students who were going to come to campus at Alma College, where I taught for almost 10 years, and help with orientation, they had orientation training on Sundays. Like, okay. So there's just not a recognition that, that might be when someone's going to church, for example.
Right.
And
Right.
so there's just, but it's not explicit hostility. It's just lots of people have grown up in a secular culture and they don't even think about it. Why
Right.
not do something on Sunday? So I think there are things like that. The other example I was going to give was I've talked with a number of peers when I was teaching and now as at Lumen Christi faculty who express a hesitance to bring their religious beliefs into the classroom. I think there's a perception that you'll be perceived as somehow less academic if you talk about religion. Even if you're talking about something like the city of God,
Right.
Augustine, like, well, let's focus on the political theory rather than, it's hard to talk about Augustine without talking about Christianity. But I think that there's a perception that there often are cases in which the Christianity is unintentionally or sometimes intentionally silenced. That's not necessarily hostility, but that it's just not there. You don't encounter it. And so without realizing it, you become secularized. And so I think that what we want to do as far as a strategy is demonstrate that the church's tradition is relevant and in all aspects of your life. It's not just this thing that you do on Sunday, but it's relevant to how you think about your money. It's relevant to how you think about marriage, and so on.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. That makes a lot of sense, and I think you're right. I think there's a silence is as relevant as any overt hostility to religion on college campuses. You've mentioned faculty recently a few times. I wondered. This is something I think about here at Upper House. How do you see scholarship, and particularly scholarship produced by the faculty that you're trying to serve, as related to what you're trying to do? So, in particularly the formation of Christians. Do you see an obvious connection there, or how do you try to engage faculty on the research they're doing on the scholarship that they're writing?
So there's a number of ways, and one has been that we think of ourselves as an institute that offers programming that is at the highest level of rigor. So, it's not sort of any less rigorous because it's about Catholic topics. So one of the things that's been central to our mission has been that we are academically rigorous and we are Catholic. And the two do not contradict each other. In fact, they can enrich each other. And so our hope is that this is something that comes through and when we have lectures and when we have seminars. And I think for some people it's more natural than others. And actually we had a wonderful speaker, Protestant actually, Warren Smith from Duke University, come speak recently. And I thought he just beautifully embodied that idea that I am a Christian and I am a scholar. And it just came through in his work as he spoke, as he gave a lecture and also led a discussion with students. So that's something that I've been starting to make a practice of reaching out to folks scholars we've invited to speak on campus and to say, look, this is something that we want to share with our students, that you can be a Catholic scholar, a Christian scholar, that the two are not contradictory. And we want you to feel free to speak both in your field and as a Catholic, and that you don't need to bracket the two off when you're here at the Institute. And I think that this is something that not just Lumen Christi, but Christian study centers, I think it's something that we have to offer that is more difficult at the university, that you can have a conversation, say, about my area is 16th century Spain. And so I've studied people who had visions, and so you can have a conversation about a woman who had a vision, Teresa of Avila. And you don't just need to have an academic conversation about it. You can also say, well, is it true? Did it actually happen? Is it good? Is it beautiful? So you can engage in it on a variety of levels. And we want folks to feel free to do that.
Yeah, that's such a hard norm to break, I guess, for a lot of faculty, right? So I think a lot of faculty who are often trained at very good institutions, but are also ones that are quite secular. Even if they're Christian, their scholarly formation happens in pretty secular settings. But in my observation, and I went through the program here at UW-Madison, so I had a lot of the same experiences. There's almost like a dualism that develops in your intellect, where you sort of have and it's not like one is less rigorous than the other, but there's just sort of the academic intellect and then the religious intellect. And I think often the trouble is that for Christian faculty, the academic intellect is way more developed than the Christian one in some, like, you're learning deeply in a particular field, and yet your understanding of theology or of the intellectual tradition of your faith is not necessarily being deepened as quickly as deep as you are in your field. And so that creates this weird dissonance and dualism. That means I think that is one of the opportunities for places like the places where both of us work that can actually call out and try to create the practice of doing that type of integration or reintegration of these two intellects. And also, in a way, I know faculty here, just like with students, there is a question about repercussions for doing that in a public setting. What will my colleagues think of me if they know that I'm actually contemplating the reality of these visions in the 16th century, right? That I'm not just treating them as a sort of traditional historian would, but I'm actually contemplating the truth of them in a sort of metaphysical sense. And I know that can be pretty challenging as well. So that's great. I'm really glad you're doing that work there. I did want to we just have a couple questions left. One of them is thinking about, because most of the people we've talked to on this series have been coming out of the Protestant higher education world, particularly the evangelical higher education world, places like Wheaton College and others. I wanted to get a sense from you. We've talked about sort of this crisis in Christian education a number of times, that there's a number of Christian colleges and seminaries that are shrinking or closing. Enrollment is declining. Just wanted to get a sense from someone in an adjacent industry, I guess, or field of Catholic higher education and Catholic education. Is there a similar sense of crisis? Is there a sense that there's massive changes on the horizon, or is there some other way of talking about that? And just the one data point that I know of just from reading the news is Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia, which is a Catholic school there, recently they were in the news because they were eliminating a lot of majors, some of them seemingly quite crucial to being a liberal arts university, because of declining enrollment. So that was just like one data point where from the outside, it's like, oh, that looks a lot like an evangelical Christian college doing the same thing. But just wonder from your perspective, how are people in sort of the Catholic education world thinking about higher education more broadly right now?
Well, before I say anything about just my own experience, I'll mention that I just saw in my email today that one of my personal heroes is a fellow named Bishop Robert Barron. He's got a big following on YouTube, and he has a show called the Word on Fire Show, and he's going to be talking about precisely this issue, about why we need the liberal arts. I think it's coming out soon, the next few days. So folks, I'm sure, might be interested in hearing what he has to say about it. I certainly will be tuning in. As far as how Catholics are thinking about these things, as a historian, one knows that it seems to be one crisis to another, right? There's always some kind of challenge that we're facing as a society, and right now we're thinking about, I think, not just in Catholic higher ed, but clearly in Christian higher ed and in higher ed in general, the challenge that the liberal arts face. And there's a couple of approaches that come to mind for me as far as how one might think about that situation. So, one is to say, well, if we lose the liberal arts, that we sort of lose the link with the church, that and there's something to that the liberal arts, studying theology, philosophy, history, literature, that's a real place where we encounter the Christian intellectual tradition in a substantive way. And there's also, I think, part of the tradition in Catholic higher ed. There's been a substantial pre-professional tradition as well. Lots of Catholic schools that for a long time have focused on pre-professional programs in nursing and business. And I think that I know I had a tendency for a long time to say, well, a real education is a liberal arts education. and that's closed-minded of me. And I think that it's my point of view has changed now. And while I still think that the liberal arts, we can't let the liberal arts go away. It's important to think about, well, how can we reflect on the intersections between the liberal arts and the professional traditions, and that's a productive way of moving forward, not to lose either one. I don't think that the liberal arts should be reduced to, say, business ethics or medical ethics. That those are good things to study, but I think there's value in just studying literature, and as well as thinking about how one can be a Catholic and a businessman, or a Christian and a lawyer. That those two things can inform one another.
Do you see your perspective on that? I know University of Chicago is known as a place that, sees itself as defending the liberal arts in a way. You mentioned the sort of unique curriculum. Do you see that? Is that sort of part of what's contributed to your development of thinking about this? Is that particular University of Chicago tradition of education, or is this something? I guess I'm wondering: is this a broader Catholic view, or is it one that's unique to University of Chicago based Catholics?
I would say, and I mean, speaking from my own experience, I would say it's both. I think one thing that was very powerful for me was going to a place, studying at a place like U Chicago, where there wasn't an engineering major when I was an undergrad. There wasn't a business major. There wasn't a nursing major, and people still managed to go into healthcare and business, and with the broad training that they had in a liberal arts field. Now it's complicated because there's also students that come out of U Chicago also had the benefit of going to an elite university, and you might say that they have an easier transition into a professional job because they have that name recognition. But it certainly was part of my formation that you can study anything and as an undergraduate, and that is great preparation just for being a human being. And I think it's also Catholic, and I would say more broadly Christian, but it goes back to the Greeks, right? That Aristotle said that we delight in reason, and so there's something about, I think, higher ed it's become our mission in a way. We've made it our mission to prepare people for careers. I think that the mission of higher ed should be preparing people for life, more broadly, and that can include your career training. But if it's only career training, then we're losing something. It has to be, we're called not just to our jobs. Those are important. Those give us dignity. I think we're called to something bigger, and higher ed should have a part in that.
Yes. Very interesting reflections. I think of an earlier era of higher ed, probably, I know they did, framed a lot of this in, citizenship was the broader category, good citizens. I think that's sort of fallen out of favor too. That's not really how a lot of universities talk about it. But there has been I guess just to wrap up the reflections here, a thinning out of what higher education is the purpose of it is. And I know here at UW we have something called the Wisconsin Idea, which is about serving the state as being a big part of what the university is doing and training people to do. And that's gotten political in recent decades as people have wondered how to focus UW's resources and whether the Wisconsin Idea should be more about technical training, or it should be more about sort of liberal arts and other things. But that's just one case. But I think the broader observation is that that's one thing I think study centers can do on these campuses is try to call the campus itself to often what are in their own mission statements, because many of those were written long ago, that there is a very capacious view of what education is for and what it's preparing students for. And it's not just careers. As you said, it's for full life, being good people, preparing people for life. And a lot of that life won't be spent at work. It'll be spent doing other things as well.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay. So Danny, one last question. I was looking around your website and I noticed a couple places where there was this phrase that I was just interested in hearing what Lumen Christi means by it, which is the evangelization of culture. I think there were a couple different programs that talked about that being part of what it was doing. And I wondered if I think I know what evangelization means on its own and what culture means on its own, but I wondered what they meant together and just what you meant by that and how Lumen Christi is aiming for the evangelization of culture.
I think I would say it has something to do with integration of faith with the rest of our lives. And I'll speak again from my own experience. One of the great revelations I had as an undergrad who was able to interact with Lumen Christi programs and other Catholic programming on campus was that the church had this amazingly broad tradition that could teach me things that were not just relevant to my strictly religious beliefs, whatever that meant, but that could inform how I voted, could help me to be a more informed citizen, could help me to think about raising a family, could help me think about the relationship between faith and work and sexuality, all sorts of things. And that, like I said, was completely unknown to me. And so we hope that the students and faculty and community members that pass through our programs will get a glimpse of this, that the church can evangelize the culture. The church has a rich tradition that can be brought to bear on thinking about all aspects of our lives.
Great. Well, that just to echo for the last time, that resonates a lot. We talk about bringing the gospel to bear on the campus and the community of UW-Madison. So very similar thinking there. Danny, it's been a pleasure to learn from you and to talk about your organization and your work down in Chicago. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me. It's been fun.
Thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to subscribe and give us a rating on your favorite podcast app. Also, be sure to check out our upcoming events on upperhouse.org and our other podcast, Upwards, where we dig deeper into the topics our in-house guests are passionate about. With Faith in Mind is supported by the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation. It is produced at Upper House in Madison, Wisconsin, hosted by Dan Hummel and John Terrill. Our executive producer and editor is Jesse Koopman. Please follow us on social media with the handle @UpperHouseUW.